Good afternoon, everyone. Planning, it's often not the most exciting thing, so I'm just going to talk nice and quickly to try and fit as much in as possible and not stand between you and getting dressed up for any longer than I need to. I'm a town planner and I work predominantly assisting clients to obtain regulatory approvals across a wide range of sectors, obviously including this one, but also energy, infrastructure, mining and agricultural value adding. The presentation's a bit more expansive than just our sector because the issues that we face are the same as issues that complex applications in other sectors face. And having worked in this sector for many years, indeed coming to this conference quite a few times, we hear common themes, and I've heard them again a few times over the last few days about approvals and how difficult they are to obtain. Unreasonable requirements, inconsistent policy, how the process is getting in the way of good outcomes. Now, all of these things are true. I've been there with a wide variety of clients on a very wide variety of projects, but I'll let you in on an unfortunate truth. None of those issues are going away, and in fact, it's most probably going to get even more difficult in future. The planning utopia of faster, better approvals with more certainty for applicants and for the community, unfortunately isn't coming to a development site near you anytime soon. When you ask people what is it you actually want from planning, you often get an answer along the lines of, I want an unfettered right to do whatever I want on my land, and I want a veto over whatever anyone else wants to do on theirs. Now, if you own an island, that's going to work pretty well, and if you don't, we have a problem. Now, I'm not getting dressed up tonight, so here's a picture of me in a 10-year-old $8 Santa suit at my annual Santa Rampage pub crawl. And here's another photo of me in that same old Santa suit, and this time I'm at a different pub called the Crown and Anchor. Anyone from South Australia? There you go, you might know the Crown and Anchor. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Many activities in our sector need more than one approval. They've got different names in different jurisdictions, but essentially we're talking about a development approval and then also operational or environmental approvals. I'm going to focus on the development approvals today. I've said for many years that our sector is typically quite good at obtaining and managing those operational approvals, which are aligned with the way that we work on a day-to-day basis. I'd also suggest our sector is typically less good at development approvals. A lot of this can be traced back to our sector being comprised of operators, not developers. So it's really logical that we're more comfortable with the things that we know well. A development approval is a point-in-time assessment of a specific proposal to determine its suitability. Typically, it assesses land use and built form in the context of a specific parcel of land and the locality that surrounds it. A development approval typically confers an inalienable set of rights upon the land, which endure in perpetuity. In all but a few cases, development approvals, irrespective of who obtains them, they will continue to travel with the land. Whoever occupies that land in future gains the benefit of that development approval automatically. Development approvals are limited to activities that are defined as development. That varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But the controls on land use tend to be broad, and often subsequent evolution or change of approved uses within that same category or genus doesn't need further assessment and approval. Development approvals also tend to be upper limiting. How high is my building? How many tonnes of material will I process? How many trucks or cars will access the site? They set maximums, they put boxes over things. Now, contemporary planning systems stream development into an assessment pathway. So, as an example, we're going to have a look at how it works here in South Australia. Let's not worry too much about exempt and accepted development. Typically, these don't require approval, or the approval's granted automatically if you meet strictly defined quantitative requirements. Let's look at what we call code assessed, more specifically the performance assessed development, and also the impact assessed development, because that's where realistically most of our projects sit. Performance assessment means that performance of a proposal is assessed on its merits against a defined set of existing policy that's called up by the combination of the site and the proposed land use. In South Australia, we've got a fully digital planning and design code as our policy document where you select the site and the proposed land use and it spits out all of the relevant policy. And the Act is very clear that that is the extent of policy that you can take into account. That's great if you're building a shop, an office, a consulting room, but it breaks down when you come to our sector. We've got a great set of definitions in our legislation for triggering referrals of our projects to the EPA, but those definitions aren't land use definitions for the purpose of calling up policy. So you end up lumped in a category called all other code assessed development, meaning that you've got to sift through loads of policy and find pretty much none that's actually useful to the assessment of your proposal. I could talk a lot about policy, but that's a talk for another day. It also means that you're almost never going to have your project exempted from public notification unless you're located smack bang in the middle of what we in South Australia call a strategic employment zone, so a heavy type industrial zone, and land in those locations is pretty rare. Now, we're almost finished the theory, so let's just quickly touch on our impact assessed development. It means exactly what it says. A proposal's assessed on the basis of the impacts it's going to cause. Less focus on pre-existing policy and broader consideration of the environmental, social and economic outcomes of its implementation. I think here in New South Wales, that's a lot of your state-significant development, where you get SEARs on a project-by-project or sometimes industry basis. So before we head for some case studies, let's look at what I want to take away when we're talking about running development applications. No matter how small, approvals need to be treated these days when they're for complex projects as a campaign, not just a technical development application. You need to operate at multiple levels, including technical assessment, key decision makers, and that can include a political process as well, engagement and social licence. And probably in contrast to the way that applications worked 20 or 30 years ago, great technical proposals frequently aren't enough to get you over the line. If you get a community movement that is against you, that gets ongoing traction, you're in a world of pain. And sometimes we see on large projects those community movements are actually AstroTurf campaigns rather than genuine community movements. Case studies, I've got 4 here, only one of which is from our sector, but all of which have common themes and are instructive to the projects that we pursue. Let's start with an example where a controversial project during the assessment process has been totally uncontroversial in operation. In the mid-1990s, we were duplicating the main highway north of Adelaide, the Port Wakefield Highway, and a borrow pit just south of the town of Dublin was spotted by an existing local operator, P. Borelli and Sons as they were at that stage, now IWS, as an opportunity to build a new landfill, noting that existing landfills in northwestern Adelaide at the time were approaching capacity. The project was advanced and was called in as a major development under our then legislation for impact assessment via an EIS by the Minister for Planning. The proposal was less than well received in the community, and a significant campaign by locals was joined by a number of environmental groups. The campaign garnered lots of media attention that was thematically based on the landfill being unnecessary Stone Age technology. We just weren't going to need more landfills. The campaign spurned these beautiful structures erected on the side of Port Wakefield Highway, where they stayed for about 30 years. The signs there were referring to the original proposal, but the signs were actually frequently updated to have a go at whoever was in government at the time. A number of them are still there, many of them have now disappeared, but they included an environmental observer in a watchtower, a UFO, an outhouse, a giant fly and a cockroach. The EIS for the project, despite having one of the worst covers ever to grace a report, you can search it and you might be able to find it. It was my company, but well before I was there. Put forward a powerful technical case for the project and highlighted its importance to the economy of the Greater Adelaide region by ensuring a long-term supply of landfill airspace. The application attracted a then record number of submissions during its public exhibition process, with almost all being opposed to the project. Ultimately approved, the proposal was constructed and it commenced operation in the early 2000s. As is the case for most large landfills in South Australia, the major development declaration remains in place after the facility commences operation, and subsequent variations and expansions are still assessed via that impact assessed process rather than it reverting to regular development applications. Larger variations require an addendum to the original EIS. In operation, the facility's largely borne out the conclusions in the original EIS, having a low complaint history, good environmental outcomes, and adapting to evolving best practice during its operational life. In 2022, a variation to the approval providing for a significant increase in finished height was assessed, with an EIS addendum considering the extent to which the visual outcomes forecast in the original EIS had come to fruition. In summary, pretty much everything that was said was going to happen originally in the EIS that was assessed in the mid-1990s had happened. All of the mitigations had functioned pretty much as they were intended to, and if anything, the performance of the site was exceeding what was initially thought to be the case. That variation to increase the height of the landfill was publicly notified during its assessment, and in contrast to the original application, not a single public submission was received. Interestingly, that fly that you saw before that stood proudly facing the highway for 2 decades was acquired by IWS when they got some additional land adjacent their site. It's now been restored to its blue gleaming glory and sits next to the site office. For an example that's a bit different, let's move away from that and look at a slightly different proposal that had a very straightforward assessment but then caused some issues when it actually got into operation. T-Ports are an innovative operator of grain ports around the Spencer Gulf. Using low draft barges, they transship grain and allow ports to be established for a fraction of the capex of a deepwater port, talking 80 to 120 million versus 800 to 1.2 billion. T-Port's second port at Wallaroo, 170 kilometres northwest of Adelaide, was approved as Crown Development, which is another impact assessment pathway that you didn't see on that diagram before in the South Australian system, that's available to private sector operators of certain facilities that typically used to be operated by the government. During the assessment process, the application was benign, well located next to other industrial development. The proposal garnered minimal public input. Acoustic modelling indicated the proposal would comply with the relevant guidelines for noise impact on the nearby sensitive receivers. However, when the facility was constructed and commissioned, a large number of noise complaints were received by the EPA, by the council and by T-Ports, and were found to trace back to faulty parts in conveyor systems. As this occurred right at the start of the operations, the community considered that the noise that they were experiencing at that point represented what was going to be the new normal for them in the area that they lived. And as a result of that and that sensitisation, significant work's been required to remediate the facility, not just replacing the faulty equipment, but also addressing issues where the modelled noise outputs didn't match the noise outputs in operation. The challenge here is that once you get that sensitisation of the community, it's very challenging to work back from that. And it's important in this case to recognise that where outcomes are assessed on the basis of predictive modelling during application processes, that process isn't perfect. Models have conservatism built in, but they're not always right. And particularly if the assumptions and data that goes into those models, particularly where there's CFD models such as noise and air quality, you can come up with outcomes that are quite a long way away from what happens in practice. Let's move on to a couple of further proposals and explore the scale of opposition to proposals and how that impacts the way that they work their way through the system. Southern Launch is a startup providing launch and return services to the international space community. They're actually got a return of a Varda satellite occurring at their Caniba test range west of Ceduna this afternoon. The Whalers Way Orbital Launch Complex at the southern tip of the Eyre Peninsula provides the only current opportunity in the world to insert payloads into polar orbit from the southern hemisphere. Assessed and approved as a major development and also being a controlled action under the Commonwealth EPBC Act, the proposal was at the extreme end of technical challenge for assessment. The project would have material and unavoidable environmental impacts, including clearance of significant native vegetation and impact on EPBC species listed as vulnerable. This was balanced against the constraints to site selection, meaning that no other realistic site candidate existed. The project attracted strong opposition from local landowners and environmental groups, but also strong support from other groups in the community, both locally on the Eyre Peninsula and more broadly. When the proposal was publicly exhibited, it garnered hundreds of submissions. What was interesting is that the submissions were balanced around 50-50 in opposition to and supportive of the project. And whilst the project garnered a fair bit of attention on social media, and there was a flow over of that into mainstream media, the narrative always remained relatively balanced, noting that there were many people opposed to the proposal, but also significant support. More significantly, whilst visible, there were various groups opposed to the project that were never able to attract huge numbers of supporters. On-site protests were in the tens, not the hundreds, and likes and shares in social media were similarly restrained. The assessment was complex, lengthy and uncertain, and 5 years elapsed between the declaration of the project as a major development and approval of both the development application and the EPBC application. Okay, let's head back to the pub. No more of me in a Santa suit. The Crown and Anchor in the Adelaide CBD, for over 100 years, its core clientele was associated with the adjacent Adelaide produce markets where wholesale fruit, vegetables and flowers were traded in the early mornings. When the market moved out in the 1990s and the site was redeveloped for mixed-use development, the Crown and Anchor, or Cranker as it's colloquially known, carved out a strong niche for live music, serving a number of genres and subcultures, but having a grimy, gritty and undoubtedly authentic feel. My annual visit in the cheap Santa suit, and whilst I'm still a recovering raver from my younger days as a full-on drum and bass addict, no trip to the Cranker failed to open my eyes to people and behaviours I didn't interact with every day. Protecting opportunities for live music has been somewhat of a totemic issue in the gentrification and densification of inner urban areas. So when a proposal emerged in 2024 for the redevelopment of the Cranker site, which extends beyond the hotel itself, that hotel building was listed as a local heritage item, but that listing only extended to the facade that you see in that image. The proposal for student accommodation was true facadism, retained the facade, but would have seen the end of the operation of the hotel in the form that it was known. So, cue the outrage. Save the Cranker became a massive refrain dominating our South Australian news cycle. Thousands of likes, shares and follows, tens of thousands of people, many of whom had either never been to the Cranker or hadn't been there for a long time, were in on the campaign because they were able to feel the way in which what was happening to that particular pub could happen to other locations. It was the thin end of the wedge. In our relentless 24-hour news cycle, the issue would flare up, it would settle, it would flare up again. Now, credit where credit's due when it comes to campaigns. The Save the Cranker campaign was sublimely run and advanced a set of themes that were persuasive and easy for people to connect with. So, enter the Premier. What we got was special purpose legislation that turned the proposal from the one you see on the left-hand side, where the facade of the original building's visible at the bottom, to the one on the right-hand side, which is almost twice as high, contains the same floor area, but preserves the pub. What's most interesting is this was done via special purpose legislation. Just turn off the planning system, come up with something that's basically an indenture act and apply that to a single project. Ultimately, that's a reflection of the fact that politics sits over the top of everything we do in planning and development. The campaign got enduring traction with something like 6% of the South Australian population interacting with it and a load of famous musicians with big social media platforms doing the same. The campaign was large enough, clear enough and enduring enough to ensure that the government, who's ultimately responsible to the people at the ballot box, saw the direction the wind was blowing. Now, our Premier in South Australia can't be accused of being indecisive, and at the moment he's got a fair bit of political capital. So when he puts forward a direction that allows both sides to win and says that's how it's going to happen, that's how it happened. So taking that and coming back to social licence, because that was very much a question of social licence. Social licence is a really complex thing. It can mean different things to different stakeholders. But the key common understanding of it is the need for projects, industries and sectors of the economy to operate in a manner that they're sufficiently tolerated by the community. How you build and maintain social licence is different in every case, which takes us back to the need to treat every project as a bespoke campaign, which requires a multi-pronged approach to deliver. So when we look at these projects that got various levels of public interaction during their assessment process, how many people spells doom for a project? How many people do you need to object before it's just never going to happen? Well, really, it might only be a few % of whatever the relevant population is. Now, moving off of planning, I'd take you to an analysis for about 15 years ago by a political scientist, Erica Chenoweth, looking at the success of mass movement campaigns intended to achieve social and political change. That found that when you had campaigns that mobilised around 3.5% of a population, people actively participating in the campaign, it was almost certain that they'd achieve their goals. That's going to be a bit hard to read, but this isn't talking about people objecting to development applications, it's talking about overthrowing governments, even remarkably heretic ones. Want to get rid of a dictator? You get 3.5% of the population out on the streets, and history says that change isn't just likely, it's close to certain. But what's more important than this is working out, when you actually see people objecting to your proposals, what's going on behind the scenes. So what Erica Chenoweth said is that if the movement's mobilising 3.5% or more of the population, there are likely much larger proportions of the population who sympathise with and support that movement. And that's really the crux of the matter, that for every person you actually see out there, there's a lot more people behind the scenes that support what it is those people are standing for. She's got a great TEDx speech if you want to understand more. Taking this back to a local level, the question's how you define your population. For development proposals, maybe it's the jurisdiction. Is it the local authority? Is it state significant? What's the spatial extent of the impacts and externalities of the proposal? Now, I don't know whether 3.5% is the definitive number when it comes to these type of development proposals, but it would seem there's a clear threshold above which sustained and visible campaigns become impossible for the decision makers, particularly elected politicians, to ignore. Once you breach that threshold, from the perspective of the proponent, you lose control of the process. And whilst you can still manage your own messaging and actions, often that's not going to be enough. The message I want to leave you with here is that when it comes to impact assessments of proposals that have significant potential for adverse amenity or environmental impacts, or an ability to sensitise the public, as a proponent, you've got to be ahead of the curve. You need to take a clear posture to mitigate regulatory risks early in the project life cycle, as in at the time the project's conceived, not after a site's been selected and not after the design's been completed. If you've done those two things already before you start thinking about how you're going to work your project through regulatory processes, it's really too late. Good regulatory processes start with site selection that involves multiple sites. Ensure you've got strategies to communicate and engage at all levels: communities, stakeholders, technocrats, and key decision makers. Social licence is built, it doesn't just emerge. But most importantly, stress test your proposals, know your strengths and weaknesses, and work out the issues and techniques that those who might be opposed to your projects will deploy. Pre-identify the items on which you can compromise and those on which you can't. In the examples I've touched on here and many more, there's frequently not a lot of correlation between projects that are controversial in their regulatory approval processes and what happens following implementation. On the whole, what we see as being quite dramatic during regulatory approval processes frequently turn out to be very benign once they're actually implemented. No matter how small, it's critical to actually treat your approval processes as a holistic campaign where you're going to engage with a broad array of stakeholders using a huge number of techniques, not just as a technical exercise. If you do that, you're maximising the probability that not only are you going to get an approval, but you're going to have a project that actually works once you finish it. Thank you.